My brother-in-law stood in my kitchen 3 days after my husband's funeral. The morning sun cast shadows across his face, but nothing could hide the coldness in his eyes. The life insurance is $2 million, Margaret. We split it 50-50, or I tell everyone about the clinic visits. His fingers drummed against the marble countertop Tom had installed for our 35th anniversary. I have copies of everything: the psychiatric hold papers, the medication lists, the suicide watch documents. I looked at this man who'd eaten Sunday dinners at my table for 23 years and smiled the same smile I'd given to difficult students for decades. Of course, Robert. Where do I sign? I signed his papers immediately, my hand steady as a rock. 2 days later, federal agents knocked on his door, and he still doesn't understand what I actually put my name to. Before we start, let us know in the comments where you're watching from. Don't forget to like, share, and subscribe for more powerful stories. My name is Margaret Helen Fisher, and at 68 years old, I thought I'd seen enough of life to never be surprised again. I was wrong. For 43 years, I was Mrs. Thomas Fisher, wife of the most decent man in Indianapolis, mother to 3 children who still called me every Sunday, and grandmother to 7 beautiful souls who thought my chocolate chip cookies could cure any heartbreak. But before all that, before I became the woman everyone knew as the gentle retired teacher who never missed a church bake sale, I was someone else entirely. I spent 32 years teaching 5th grade at Riverside Elementary. 32 years of scraped knees and tearful confessions, of proud moments watching struggling readers finally grasp a paragraph, of using my lunch money to buy supplies for kids whose families couldn't afford them. Tom used to joke that I'd adopted 300 children over my career. He wasn't entirely wrong. My refrigerator was covered in wedding invitations and birth announcements from former students, some now in their 40s, who still called me Mrs. Fisher and hugged me in grocery stores. Tom and I built our life slowly, carefully, like a garden you tend to every single day. We started with nothing but his apprentice carpenter's salary and my first-year teacher's paycheck. We saved every penny, drove used cars until they died, mended clothes instead of buying new ones. When Robert was gambling away his paycheck in Vegas, Tom was teaching himself investment strategies at the library. When Robert's 3rd business venture failed, we were putting our kids through college debt-free. We weren't rich by magazine standards, but we were wealthy in all the ways that mattered. The last 5 years tested everything we'd built. Tom's pancreatic cancer diagnosis came the week of our 40th anniversary. I retired early to become his full-time caregiver, learning to manage IV drips and medication schedules, transforming our bedroom into a makeshift hospital ward. I held his hand through 37 rounds of chemotherapy, read him every John Grisham novel twice, and learned to make marijuana brownies when nothing else helped the nausea. I sold my mother's jewelry to pay for an experimental treatment insurance wouldn't cover. I would have sold my soul to buy him more time. Through it all, I never let Tom see me cry. That was my gift to him, my strength when his was failing. But he knew. Of course he knew. Just like he'd known 15 years earlier when I'd needed help myself, when darkness had swallowed me whole after we lost our first grandchild. Tom had been my lighthouse then. Now it was my turn to be his. The house felt different without Tom's breathing machine humming through the night, but I'd found my rhythm in the silence. 3 weeks had passed since the funeral, and I'd developed a routine that kept me anchored when grief threatened to pull me under. Every morning at 6:30, I made coffee in Tom's favorite mug, the one Sarah had made in her high school ceramics class, with "World's Best Dad" painted in crooked letters. The coffee was always too strong, the way he liked it, and I'd sit in his spot at the kitchen table, watching cardinals visit the bird feeder he'd built our last healthy spring together. The insurance paperwork sat in neat piles on Tom's desk, waiting for final processing. $2 million. It seemed surreal that Tom's death could be reduced to a number, but he'd been meticulous about provisions. He'd increased the policy after his diagnosis, wanting to ensure I'd never have to worry. "Margaret," he'd said, holding my hand in the lawyer's office, "you gave up everything to take care of me. This is my way of taking care of you when I'm gone. The money would pay off Sarah's mortgage, help Michael with his mounting medical bills from his own battle with Crohn's disease, and establish college funds for all 7 grandchildren. The rest would keep me comfortable without being extravagant, just the way Tom would have wanted." Tuesday mornings were for grocery shopping at Kroger, where Bethany at the checkout always asked how I was really doing and meant it. I'd buy ingredients for meals I was still learning to cook, for one, though I couldn't break the habit of making too much. The extra portions went to Mrs. Chen next door, who was 93 and pretended she was doing me a favor by accepting them. Wednesday afternoons meant the garden, where Tom's tomatoes were coming in beautifully, as if he was still tending them somehow. I'd planted marigolds around them because he always said they kept the aphids away, and keeping his garden alive felt like keeping a piece of him breathing. Thursday was book club, with the same 5 women I'd been meeting for 12 years. We were reading Educated by Tara Westover, though we spent more time talking about our grandchildren and sharing recipes than discussing the book. They never mentioned Tom directly, but Patricia always brought an extra casserole in case I forgot to eat, and Linda always offered to drive even though I was perfectly capable. Their quiet care wrapped around me like a warm shawl. Sundays were for family. Sarah came with her 3 kids, bringing chaos and laughter that filled the empty spaces. 10-year-old Emma would curl up beside me on the couch, reading quietly while her brothers played video games on Tom's old television. "Grandma," she'd asked last week, "do you think Grandpa can see us from heaven?" I told her I believed he could, and that he was probably critiquing her brother's football throwing form from up there. Michael called from California, his voice tired but warm, always checking if I needed anything, if the house repairs were holding up, if I was taking my vitamins. The life insurance adjuster had called yesterday, confirming the payout would be processed within 2 weeks. I'd already made appointments with the financial advisor Tom trusted, planning to set up the education trusts and charitable donations Tom and I had discussed during his clearer moments. The community food bank would receive a substantial donation in Tom's name, and the elementary school where I'd taught would finally get new playground equipment. Everything was falling into place, exactly as Tom had planned, providing security and peace in the wake of loss. I had no idea that Robert had been planning something entirely different. The day after Tom's funeral, I found Robert in Tom's study. I'd come downstairs at 2 a.m. for water, unable to sleep in our 2 empty bed, when I saw the desk lamps glow under the door. My heart had leaped for one impossible second, thinking maybe it had all been a nightmare. Maybe Tom was just working late on his model trains. But it was Robert, hunched over Tom's filing cabinet, with his phone flashlight, photographing documents one by one. "Robert," I'd whispered from the doorway, and he jumped, nearly dropping his phone. "Oh, Margaret," he said, forcing a laugh that sounded hollow in the quiet house. "Couldn't sleep either, huh? I was just looking for that photo of Dad and Tom from the fishing trip to Lake Michigan. Tom always said he kept it in here somewhere." His explanation came too quickly, words tumbling over each other. I noticed he'd already been through 3 drawers, papers scattered across the desk in a way Tom would have hated. "Let me help you look," I offered, stepping forward, but he immediately began closing drawers. No, don't trouble yourself. It's probably not even here. You should get some rest." The next morning, Robert and his wife Linda stayed for breakfast, though neither of them ate much. Linda kept steering the conversation toward Tom's final months, her questions feeling more like an interrogation than concern. Was Tom taking morphine at the end? Oxycodone? Those drugs can really affect someone's judgment, can't they? She stirred her coffee with precise movements, eyes never leaving my face. Did he make any major decisions while on pain medication? Sign anything important? I remember the chill that ran through me at her tone. Tom's mind was clear until the very end, I said firmly. The oncologist was very careful with the dosing. Why do you ask? Linda exchanged a quick glance with Robert before smiling, the expression not reaching her eyes. Oh, just wondering. It must have been so hard for you, managing all those medications. Did you have help? A nurse? Someone who witnessed his state of mind? Robert interrupted, his voice too casual. Speaking of Tom's affairs, did he use the same lawyer for everything? The will, the insurance policies, everything? The question felt loaded somehow. Why would you need to know that, Robert? I asked. He shrugged. Buttering toast he wouldn't eat. Just thinking you might need help sorting through everything. Legal matters can be overwhelming for someone who's grieving. Later that afternoon, I found Linda in our bedroom. She claimed to be looking for the bathroom, despite having visited our home dozens of times over the years. She was standing by my dresser, my prescription bottles in her hands. "Oh, Margaret," she said, not even trying to look embarrassed. "I was just checking if you had anything for my headache." The bottles she held were clearly labeled with my name. Medications for blood pressure and cholesterol. Nothing for headaches. But there was something else in her expression, a satisfaction that made no sense. That evening, as they prepared to leave, Robert lingered by Tom's desk again. I watched from the kitchen as he ran his fingers along the edges of drawers, checking for hidden compartments Tom didn't have. He picked up Tom's letter opener, the one from his retirement party, studying it like it might be worth something. Tom always had nice things, he murmured, more to himself than to me. He was good with money. Very good. Something was wrong. The brother-in-law who'd barely visited during Tom's illness was suddenly very interested in every detail of our lives, our finances, our private matters. But grief does strange things to people, I told myself. Perhaps he was just processing Tom's death differently, trying to hold on to his brother through his possessions. I spent the next 2 days telling myself stories that made sense, explanations that painted Robert as grieving rather than greedy. Tom always said I looked for the best in people, sometimes to a fault, and maybe that was what I was doing now. Robert had lost his only brother. They'd grown up together in that tiny house on Meridian Street, shared bunk beds until Tom left for college, learned to fish from the same father who died too young. Surely his odd behavior was just grief manifesting in strange ways. When I found him in Tom's workshop, running his hands over the table, saw, and drill press, I told myself he was remembering the treehouse they'd built together for Sarah when she was 7. "Tom taught me to use tools in this garage," he said, without looking at me, and I heard genuine emotion in his voice. He was always better at making things than I was. That had to be it, I reasoned. Robert was just trying to feel close to his brother through his possessions, the tools Tom's hands had held, the spaces where he'd spent his time. I even rationalized finding him on Tom's computer. He claimed he was looking for photos from their mother's funeral to create a memorial slideshow, and why shouldn't I believe him? The browser history showing searches for Indiana inheritance law and contesting life insurance beneficiaries must have been from Tom himself, I decided, probably researching to make sure everything was in order. Tom was thorough like that, always double-checking important details. When Linda called 3 times in one day asking about Tom's mental state in his final months, I convinced myself she was worried about me. "You must have been under such stress, Margaret," she kept saying. "Caregiver fatigue is real. Did you ever feel overwhelmed? Depressed? Did you ever need professional help?" Perhaps she was clumsily trying to ensure I was taking care of my mental health. After all, I'd hidden my past struggles with depression from most people, but maybe Tom had mentioned it to Robert years ago, seeking advice about how to support me. The manila envelope I found in the guest room trash, filled with photocopies of Tom's bank statements, had a reasonable explanation, too. Robert was an accountant, wasn't he? Before his construction business, before the failed restaurant venture, he'd worked in finance. Maybe he was trying to help me understand our financial situation, gathering information to assist with taxes or estate planning. The fact that he hadn't asked permission was just Robert being Robert, always overstepping but meaning well. Even when Mrs. Chen mentioned seeing Robert's car in our driveway while I was at my doctor's appointment, I brushed it off. He had a key from when he'd helped during Tom's treatments. He'd probably stopped by to check on the house, make sure everything was secure. That was what family did, wasn't it? They looked out for each other, even if their methods were sometimes intrusive. "You're being paranoid, Margaret," I told my reflection while brushing my teeth that night. "This is what grief does. It makes you suspicious, anxious, sees threats where there are none." I remembered how I'd convinced myself the hospital was lying about our grandchild's death 15 years ago, how depression had twisted my thinking into dark spirals. This had to be similar, grief playing tricks on my mind. But as I lay in bed, I couldn't shake the image of Robert's face when he'd asked about the life insurance over dinner, the way his eyes had sharpened when I'd mentioned the amount, how Linda had grabbed his hand under the table, not in comfort, but in excitement. "No," I told myself firmly, pulling Tom's pillow closer. Family doesn't betray family. Not like that. Not Robert, who Tom had bailed out of debt twice, who we'd spent 23 Christmases with. I was wrong, of course. Sometimes the wolves we need to fear most are the ones we've invited to our table. Thursday afternoon, I decided to finally tackle Tom's filing cabinet, the one he'd meticulously organized, but I'd been avoiding since his death. The insurance company needed our marriage certificate, and I knew exactly where Tom kept it. 3rd drawer, folder labeled Legal Documents, in his perfect handwriting. But when I opened the drawer, nothing was where it should be. Files were shoved in backwards, papers crumpled at the edges, tabs bent and torn. Tom, who'd arranged his socks by color and dated every receipt, would have been horrified. The legal documents folder was there, but our marriage certificate was missing. Instead, I found medical papers that belonged in a completely different drawer. As I reached for the medical history folder to restore order, my hand froze. The folder was twice as thick as it should be, stuffed with papers I didn't recognize. With trembling fingers, I opened it and felt the blood drain from my face. They were my records. My private psychiatric records from Riverside Mental Health Center, from 15 years ago when darkness had swallowed me whole after losing baby James, our first grandchild. Pages and pages I thought had been destroyed, documenting my 72-hour voluntary hold, the severe postpartum depression by proxy that even my own children never knew about. The medication lists were all there: Lexapro, Xanax, Ambien. The therapy notes describing my persistent intrusive thoughts and complicated grief disorder. The discharge summary noting, patient stabilized but requires ongoing monitoring. These records weren't supposed to be here. They weren't even supposed to exist in paper form. I'd specifically requested they remain sealed in the hospital's electronic system, accessible only to my treating physician, Tom had known, of course. He'd driven me there himself, held my hand through intake, visited every day despite the 2-hour drive. But we'd never kept copies. We never wanted reminders of that terrible time when I'd stood at the edge of an abyss and nearly jumped. Underneath the medical records was a yellow legal pad with Robert's handwriting, notes in his cramped script. MH hold 2010, depression diagnosis, anxiety medication, possible grounds for mental incompetence, check Indiana law on psychiatric history and inheritance. Can past mental illness invalidate beneficiary status? Below that, phone numbers I didn't recognize, one circled twice with lawyer estate disputes, written beside it. My legs gave out, and I sank into Tom's desk chair. The violation felt physical, like Robert had reached into my chest and grabbed my heart with dirty fingers. But worse was the calculation of it. This wasn't grief-driven confusion. This was reconnaissance, strategic planning. Robert had been in my home, searching through our private papers while I served him coffee and worried about his grief. Then I found the business card, expensive cream cardstock tucked between pages describing my darkest moments. Harrison and Associates, estate planning and dispute resolution. On the back, a handwritten note. She signed voluntary commitment papers, history of mental illness, $2 million in life insurance. Call me. RF. Robert's initials. The date was from 2 weeks ago, while Tom was still alive, still fighting, still hoping. I reached for my phone to check our security system's history. Robert's code had been used 6 times in the past 2 weeks. Always when I was at the hospital with Tom, or at my grief counseling sessions. He'd been methodical, careful, choosing times he knew I'd be gone for hours. The last entry was yesterday, during my book club. 3 hours he'd been here, going through our lives like a vulture picking bones. At the bottom of the pile, I found the worst violation. Photocopies of Tom's final medical reports, the ones describing his medication regime. Robert had highlighted every mention of morphine, every note about Tom's alertness levels. In the margin, he'd written, "Proof of impaired judgment? Could she have influenced him?" The man who'd given a toast at our 40th anniversary was building a case to steal everything my dying husband had left me, using the worst moment of my life as his weapon. 3 days after the funeral, I was washing Tom's coffee mug when Robert's BMW pulled into the driveway. No Linda this time. He walked in without knocking, something he'd never done when Tom was alive. His face was different, the mask of grieving brother completely gone, replaced by something cold and calculating that made me step back from the sink. "Margaret, we need to have a real conversation." He set his briefcase on my kitchen table, the one where he'd carved his initials as a child visiting Tom, where we'd celebrated 50 family dinners. About Tom's estate, about what's fair, about what you deserve versus what you're trying to take. What I'm trying to take? My voice came out steadier than I felt. "Robert, what are you talking about?" He opened his briefcase with practiced precision, pulling out folders I recognized with a sick lurch. My medical records, the photocopies of Tom's bank statements, the insurance policies. He arranged them like evidence in a trial, his movements deliberate and threatening. "Let's discuss what I know, Margaret." He pulled out a chair and sat down uninvited. 15 years ago, you were institutionalized. Psychiatric hold, severe depression, suicidal ideation, according to these notes. You were on enough medication to stock a pharmacy. Xanax for anxiety, Ambien for sleep, Lexapro for depression. A cocktail of mental instability. Each word felt like a slap. "Those records are private. How did you—" "I have friends at the hospital. People who understand that families deserve to know when someone mentally unstable is controlling millions of dollars. He leaned back, studying me like I was a problem to be solved. Your own children don't know about this, do they? Sarah still thinks you were at that teaching conference in Chicago. Michael believes you were helping your sister recover from surgery. My knees felt weak, but I forced myself to remain standing. That was 15 years ago. I sought help for grief. Tom knew everything. Tom knew. Past tense. Tom's dead, Margaret. The casualness of his cruelty took my breath away. And I'm wondering if a woman with your history should really be trusted with his estate. I'm wondering what your church friends would think, knowing their beloved Margaret spent time in a mental ward. What the school board would say about giving you that retirement recognition plaque when they find out you were too mentally ill to trust with children. You wouldn't. But looking at his face, I knew he would. The life insurance is $2 million, he continued, pulling out a document. Tom was my brother, my blood. That money belongs to the Fisher family, not just the woman who happened to marry into it. You can avoid all this unpleasantness, keep your reputation intact, maintain your relationships with your children who trust you, if you simply sign this agreement. 50-50 split, $1 million each, clean and simple. Tom left that money to me. He wanted me to. Tom was on enough morphine to kill a horse. Robert slammed his hand on the table, making me jump. His last 3 months, he didn't know what day it was half the time. Any decent lawyer could argue you exerted undue influence over a dying man. Add your history of mental illness, your access to his medications, the fact that you were alone with him when he signed those final papers. Margaret, I could make a very compelling case that you manipulated my dying brother. That's a lie. Tom's mind was clear. Dr. Patterson confirmed, doctors can be wrong. Juries love a good story about a gold-digging wife with a psychiatric history taking advantage of a cancer patient. He pushed the paper toward me. Or you can sign this now. Your choice. Your reputation and relationship with your children. Or your greed. What's it worth to you, Margaret? Is money worth losing everything else? I stared at the man I'd once considered family, who'd eaten at my table, held my grandchildren, who'd cried on Tom's shoulder when his business failed, and saw a stranger wearing Robert's face. As I picked up Robert's document with shaking hands, I realized this wasn't just about the life insurance. The agreement was 12 pages long, professionally drafted by Harrison and Associates, dated 2 weeks before Tom's death. They'd been planning this while I was spoon-feeding Tom his last meals, while I was singing him the songs his mother used to sing, while he was using his remaining strength to tell me he loved me one more time. The document didn't just demand half the insurance money. Robert wanted joint ownership of our vacation cabin in Brown County, the one where Tom had proposed to me 34 years ago. He wanted Tom's investment portfolio, the careful stock selections we'd built over decades of sacrifice. Eating beans and rice so we could invest $50 here, $100 there. He wanted the classic car collection Tom had lovingly restored, spending Sunday afternoons in the garage teaching our grandson Jake about engines while rebuilding his 1967 Mustang. Page 6 made me gasp aloud. Robert had listed every asset we owned, down to Tom's father's pocket watch and my mother's pearl necklace. He knew about the safety deposit box at Fifth Third Bank, the one with our emergency cash and my grandmother's ring. He knew about the college funds we'd started for each grandchild, somehow had the exact amounts. He'd even found the small inheritance from my aunt that we'd never touched, keeping it as our final emergency fund. You've been through everything, I whispered, horrified by the thoroughness of his invasion. Our entire lives. I've been protecting family interests, Robert said smoothly. Tom accumulated significant wealth that rightfully belongs to the Fisher bloodline. You were just the wife. I'm his brother, his blood. But there was more. On page 8, I found references to conversations with supporting witnesses. My nephew David, Robert's son, was listed as prepared to testify about my erratic behavior at family gatherings, citing an incident where I'd cried at Thanksgiving. It had been 2 weeks after losing baby James, but the document painted it as evidence of my instability. Linda's signature appeared as a witness to my concerning medication use, though she'd only ever seen me take aspirin for headaches. The conspiracy went even deeper. Robert had been in contact with Tom's estranged cousin Gerald in Florida, promising him a cut if he contested the will as a blood relative. He'd researched Indiana inheritance law and found a provision about challenging beneficiaries with documented mental illness. He'd hired a private investigator to photograph me at my psychiatrist's office, the one I still saw monthly for grief counseling, spinning routine therapy as evidence of ongoing mental problems. You called Dr. Morrison's office, I said, recognizing a phone number on page 10. You tried to get my current therapy records. Thorough preparation prevents poor outcomes, Robert replied, using Tom's own favorite, saying like a weapon. Your psychiatrist wouldn't cooperate, but it doesn't matter. The fact you're still seeing him proves ongoing mental health issues. The final pages revealed the full scope of his plan. If I refused to sign, Robert wouldn't just challenge the will. He'd petition for a competency hearing, arguing I was mentally unfit to manage the estate. He'd already consulted with Adult Protective Services about concerns for my well-being. He had photos of me crying at the cemetery, at the funeral home, in my car outside the hospital, each one date-stamped and labeled as evidence of deteriorating mental state. Linda's been documenting everything, he said, noticing me staring at the photos. Every tear, every moment you seemed confused or overwhelmed, grief or mental illness. A judge might not see the difference, especially with your history. I saw Linda's handwriting on sticky notes attached to the photos, talking to headstone, hallucinations, sitting in car for 2 hours, catatonic, wearing same clothes 3 days, self-neglect. This wasn't just greed. This was a methodical, calculated assassination of my character, designed to steal not just Tom's money but everything we'd built together, using my lowest moment as ammunition. After Robert left, promising to return in 24 hours for my signature, I collapsed onto the kitchen floor, the cold tile pressed against my cheek as sobs tore through me. The kind of crying that comes from somewhere deeper than tears, from the place where we store our worst fears about ourselves. Everything I'd fought to overcome, every demon I'd battled and defeated, was being dragged into the light and twisted into weapons against me. I crawled to Tom's chair in the living room, pulling myself into the worn leather that still smelled faintly of his cologne. Old Spice classic that he'd worn since 1979. My fingers found the indent where his head had rested for 40 years, and I pressed my face there, trying to breathe him back into existence. Tom, I whispered to the empty room, I don't know how to fight this without you. The memories came in waves, each one cutting deeper than the last. I remembered the night I'd finally told Tom about my breakdown 15 years ago, how I'd been volunteering in the maternity ward when I held baby James for the first time, my first grandchild, Sarah's son. When they lost him to SIDS 3 days later, something inside me had shattered. I'd stood in my classroom 2 weeks later, looking at my 5th graders' innocent faces, and couldn't remember how to speak. The words simply wouldn't come. Tom had found me sitting in my car in the school parking lot 6 hours later, engine still running, staring at nothing. "You're the strongest woman I know," he'd said when he drove me to Riverside Mental Health Center. "Asking for help isn't weakness, Margaret. It's the bravest thing you can do." He'd visited every day of my 72-hour hold bringing crossword, puzzles and pictures of our children, reminding me of all the reasons to keep fighting. He'd never once looked at me differently, never treated me as fragile or broken. Now his own brother wanted to use that courage against me, to paint my survival as insanity. I thought about all the sacrifices we'd made that Robert would never know or care about. The anniversary trip to Paris we'd canceled to pay for his first bankruptcy lawyer. The retirement party I'd skipped to help Linda when she'd had her nervous breakdown, though apparently her mental health struggles weren't fodder for blackmail. The $30,000 we'd loaned him for his restaurant, never repaid, never mentioned again. Tom working double shifts despite his bad back to help Robert keep his house during the recession. "We're family," Tom had always said when I'd questioned another bailout. "Family takes care of each other." The cruelty of it broke something inside me. While Tom was dying, while I was mixing his medications at 3 a.m. and cleaning vomit from his chest, Robert had been planning this betrayal. While I was reading Tom his favorite psalms and holding ice chips to his cracked lips, his brother was researching ways to destroy me. Every "How's Tom doing?" had been reconnaissance. Every "You look tired, Margaret" had been documentation. I pulled out my phone and scrolled through photos from our 40th anniversary party. Robert's toast. "To Margaret, the sister I never had, who made my brother the happiest man alive." The photo of him hugging me, Linda wiping away tears. All performance, all lies. The worst part was the contamination of memories. Now every family gathering was tainted, every kind gesture suspect. Had Robert ever actually cared about us? When he taught Jake to ride a bike, was he already calculating the value of our assets? When he'd cried at Tom's bedside, was he mourning his brother or anticipating his profit? I stayed in that chair until sunrise, crying until I had no tears left, grieving not just Tom but the family I thought we had, the trust I'd never question again, the innocence of believing that love meant something more than money. At 2 a.m., something shifted. I was still in Tom's chair, staring at our wedding photo on the mantel, when his words echoed in my memory, clear as if he was sitting beside me. It was from 3 weeks before he died, during one of his lucid moments between morphine doses. He'd gripped my hand with surprising strength and said, "Margaret, promise me something. After I'm gone, don't let anyone make you small. You've spent your whole life being kind, but kindness without boundaries is just another form of self-destruction. You're stronger than you know, sweetheart. Don't forget that when I'm not here to remind you." I stood up, my knees protesting after hours of immobility, and walked to Tom's study. The room still smelled like him, pencil shavings and coffee, and that particular scent of old books. I turned on his desk, lamp, and pulled out his law books from his brief stint considering law school in 1978. Thompson's Guide to Federal Law, Understanding Insurance Fraud, Criminal Justice Procedures. He'd kept them all, organized with typical Tom precision. Something was building in my chest, not rage exactly, but something cleaner, clearer, resolution. I opened my laptop and began typing. What constitutes insurance fraud? What constitutes blackmail? HIPAA violations penalties. Federal crimes versus state crimes. Each search gave me more ammunition, more understanding. Robert thought I was just a retired schoolteacher, a grieving widow who would crumble under pressure. He'd forgotten that teachers are researchers, investigators, strategic planners who manage 30 different personalities while teaching complex concepts. He'd forgotten that I'd raised 3 children, survived loss that would break most people, and spent 32 years dealing with bullies. I found a legal pad, Tom's favorite yellow ones, and began making lists. Everything Robert had done, every law he'd broken, every piece of evidence I had. My handwriting, usually soft and curved from years of writing on blackboards, became sharp and precise. HIPAA violations, illegally obtaining psychiatric records, federal crime, up to 10 years prison, blackmail, using threat of exposure to obtain money, federal crime if crossing state lines or involving federal institutions like insurance, fraud, presenting false documents, forging signatures, conspiracy to commit fraud, breaking and entering, using emergency key for non-emergency purposes without permission. I pulled up our security systems app on my phone, downloading every entry, every timestamp of Robert's intrusions. I found our old recorder, the one Tom used for dictating notes, and tested the battery. Still working. I could record our next conversation, Indiana being a one-party consent state for recordings. At 4 a.m., I called my former student Jessica Martinez, now Special Agent Martinez with the FBI's White-Collar Crime Division. She'd sent a beautiful flower arrangement for Tom's funeral with a note saying, "Mrs. Fisher, you taught me to always stand up to bullies. I learned that lesson well." She answered on the 3rd ring, alert despite the hour. Federal agents, I remembered, were used to odd hours. "Jessica," I said, my voice stronger than it had been in weeks, "I need your help. I believe I'm the victim of an elaborate insurance fraud scheme involving blackmail and HIPAA violations." "Mrs. Fisher, are you safe? Do you need immediate assistance?" "I'm safe, but I need to know my options. The person trying to blackmail me is coming back tomorrow for my signature on fraudulent documents. He's threatened to destroy my reputation using illegally obtained medical records if I don't give him half of my husband's life insurance." There was a pause, then Jessica's voice turned professional. "Can you come to the federal building this morning? Bring everything you have. And Mrs. Fisher, don't sign anything. If what you're describing is accurate, we're talking about multiple federal crimes." I hung up and looked at Tom's picture on his desk, the one from our trip to Yellowstone where he was laughing at something I'd said. "You were right, Tom. I am stronger than I knew, and your brother is about to learn exactly how strong." Jessica Martinez met me at the federal building at 7 a.m. Professional in her navy suit, but with the same warm eyes I remembered from 5th grade. She led me to a secure conference room where 2 other agents waited, introduced as Special Agent Davis from insurance fraud and Special Agent Chen from healthcare fraud. I spread Robert's documents across the table like dealing cards for a game I was finally ready to play. "Mrs. Fisher," Agent Davis said after reviewing everything, "what your brother-in-law has done constitutes multiple federal crimes. The HIPAA violations alone could put him away for a decade. But we need more than what you have here. We need him on recording, making these threats explicitly. We need the actual documents he wants you to sign." Jessica leaned forward. "Here's what we're proposing. You wear a wire. Get him to admit to everything, the blackmail, how he obtained the records, his entire plan. Then, instead of signing his papers, you give him ours." Agent Chen pulled out a stack of official documents. "These are cooperation agreements and fraud reporting forms. They look like estate paperwork at first glance. If he signs them without reading, which most criminals do when they think they've won, he's essentially confessing to federal crimes. His signature becomes evidence of his participation in the conspiracy." I studied the documents, my teacher's eye catching the brilliance of their construction. The headers were bland, mentioning estate distribution agreements and asset transfer protocols, but buried in the legal language were admissions of obtaining medical records through fraudulent means, acknowledgement of using coercion to obtain financial gain, and consent to federal investigation of all financial records. What about his accomplices? I asked. His wife Linda, the hospital employee who gave him my records, his son David, who agreed to lie. Once we have Robert, they'll fold, Jessica said confidently. Conspiracy charges have a way of making people very cooperative. But Robert is the ringleader. He's the one we need. We spent 3 hours preparing. They coached me on what to say, how to get Robert to elaborate on his threats, how to appear defeated while gathering evidence. Agent Davis revealed something that made my spine straighten. They'd been investigating Robert's construction business for 2 years, suspecting insurance fraud but lacking proof. My case could break everything open. There's one more thing, Agent Chen said, pulling up files on his laptop. We did some digging. Your brother-in-law has been filing false insurance claims for his construction company, inflating damages, claiming injuries for non-existent employees. He's stolen approximately $3 million over the past 5 years. Your situation gave us the probable cause we needed to expand our investigation. They fitted me with a recording device so small it looked like a button on my cardigan. We rehearsed scenarios, planned for contingencies. If Robert became violent, I had a panic button that would bring agents within seconds. They would be in a van outside my house, monitoring everything. You don't have to do this, Jessica said, as we prepared to leave. We could arrest him based on what we have, but the case would be weaker. I thought of Tom, of his faith in justice, of the years Robert had smiled to our faces while stealing from insurance companies, and now trying to steal from Tom's memory. My husband always said I was too nice, but he also said that good people have to stand up to bad ones, or the bad ones always win. I'm doing this. Back home, I arranged the formal dining room like a stage. Tom's portrait on the wall would witness everything. I placed the federal documents in a leather folder identical to the one Robert used, practicing my defeated widow act in the mirror. My hands didn't shake anymore. 32 years of managing difficult parents and troubled children had taught me to perform calmness I didn't feel. I was ready to give Robert exactly what he deserved. Robert arrived at exactly 10 a.m. the next morning, punctual in his victory. I watched from the window as he sat in his BMW for a full minute, probably savoring his anticipated triumph. Linda was with him, dressed in a new designer outfit I suspected she'd bought in celebration of their coming windfall. They walked to my door like conquerors approaching a defeated city. I opened the door before they could ring, playing the part of the broken widow perfectly. I deliberately not slept, letting exhaustion paint authentic shadows under my eyes. My hair was uncombed, my clothes wrinkled, the same black dress I'd worn to Tom's funeral. Come in, I whispered, my voice carefully crafted to sound hollow, defeated. Robert's eyes gleamed with satisfaction as he took in my appearance. Margaret, you look terrible. This stress isn't good for someone your age, especially with your history. He emphasized the last word, twisting the knife. I'm glad you've come to your senses. This is best for everyone. The dining room felt smaller with them in it. Linda immediately went to the china cabinet, running her fingers over my grandmother's Waterford crystal, already calculating its value. These are lovely, Margaret. Family heirlooms should stay in the family, don't you think? The threat was clear. Cooperate, or we'll come for everything. Robert had brought a notary, a nervous young man who clearly had no idea what he was witnessing. This is Stan, Robert said, clapping the man on the shoulder. He'll make everything official, all perfectly legal and above board. Stan began arranging his stamps and seals, avoiding eye contact with everyone, probably sensing the tension but not understanding its source. "I've brought multiple copies," Robert said, spreading his documents across my dining table like a card dealer. "One for you, one for me, one for filing. I've also taken the liberty of drafting a statement for your children, explaining that you've chosen to share Tom's estate with his family out of love and respect for his memory. It'll keep things peaceful." The manipulation was breathtaking. He'd thought of everything, even controlling the narrative with my children. I noticed he'd added pages since yesterday, probably more claims, more demands thought of in the greedy hours of the night. Linda pulled out her phone, already recording, thinking she was documenting my surrender. "Before we begin," I said softly, "I need to understand everything. For my own peace of mind, can you explain exactly what you're asking for?" This was Jessica's coaching, getting him to state his demands clearly for the recording. Robert smiled, mistaking my question for submission. "Of course, Margaret. Full transparency. I'm entitled to half of Tom's life insurance, $2 million divided equally. The vacation property should be joint ownership, since Tom would want his family legacy preserved. The investment portfolio needs professional management, which I'll oversee to protect your interests, given your condition." He tapped the stack of my psychiatric records he'd brought, laying them out like playing cards. "And if I refuse?" I asked, though we all knew the answer. "Then I file competency hearings tomorrow morning. I share these records with Sarah and Michael, explaining how their mother has been hiding severe mental illness for 15 years. I contact the school board about their retired teacher's psychiatric history. I reach out to your church, your book club, everyone who thinks Margaret Fisher is the perfect grandmother." He leaned back, supremely confident. "You'll lose everything, Margaret. Your reputation, your children's trust, maybe even your freedom if the court decides you need supervision." Linda added, "We're actually doing you a favor. This way, you keep your dignity. Your secrets stay secret. Everyone wins." The notary shifted uncomfortably, but began preparing his stamps. Robert pushed his papers toward me, a gold-plated pen extended like a weapon. "Sign here, here, and here. Initial each page. Then we can all move forward." I reached for my identical leather folder, my movements deliberately shaky. "I have some papers too," I said. "Just receipts for items from the estate you're taking. For taxes." Robert barely glanced at them, victory making him careless. "Fine. Whatever makes you comfortable." Robert grabbed my papers without even looking at them, his arrogance blinding him completely. "Stan, notarize these as well," he ordered, already signing his name with flourishing strokes. "Receipt for estate items, Margaret? How wonderfully meticulous. Tom would be proud of your attention to detail." The mockery in his voice made Linda smirk as she continued recording what she believed was my humiliation. I watched him sign each page of the Federal Cooperation Agreement, his signature authorizing investigation into his finances, admitting to coercion, acknowledging the illegal acquisition of medical records. The notary, just doing his job, stamped each page with official seals, making Robert's confession legally binding and court admissible. Robert even initialed the section about conspiracy to commit insurance fraud, probably thinking it was about tax deductions. "Now your turn, Margaret," Robert said, pushing his documents toward me. I picked up the pen slowly, my hand hovering over the signature line. Through the dining room window, I could see a black van parked across the street, exactly where Jessica said it would be. "Actually, Robert," I said, setting the pen down with deliberate calm, I don't think I'll be signing anything today." His face flushed red. "We had a deal. You agreed. I agreed to nothing. But you, on the other hand, just signed a full confession to multiple federal crimes." I pulled out my phone, showing him the recording app that had been running the entire time. "Everything's been recorded. Your threats, your blackmail, your admission to obtaining my medical records illegally." Robert lunged for the papers he'd just signed, but I pulled them away. His eyes scanned the first page frantically, the color draining from his face as he realized what he'd actually signed. This is entrapment. You tricked me." "No, Robert. You tried to blackmail a widow 3 days after her husband's funeral. You committed federal crimes and were arrogant enough to think I'd just roll over and let you steal what Tom left me." I stood up, finding strength I'd forgotten I had. "You thought grief made me weak. You thought my past made me vulnerable. You were wrong." Linda dropped her phone, scrambling to grab the documents. "This isn't legal. We'll sue. The doorbell rang. I opened it to reveal Jessica Martinez and 4 other federal agents. "Federal Bureau of Investigation," Jessica announced, her badge gleaming. "Robert Fisher, Linda Fisher. You're under arrest for conspiracy to commit insurance fraud, blackmail, HIPAA violations, and interstate wire fraud." "This is insane," Robert shouted as Agent Davis pulled his hands behind his back. "She's mentally ill. Check her records. She was in a psychiatric hospital." 15 years ago, seeking help for grief," Jessica said calmly, "which you discovered through illegal means, attempting to use protected medical information for extortion. That's a federal crime carrying up to 10 years in prison." The notary stood frozen, clutching his stamp. "I didn't know," he stammered. "They just said estate papers. You're a witness, not a suspect," Agent Chen assured him. "We'll need your statement." As they led Robert out, he turned to me with pure hatred. "Tom would be disgusted. Family doesn't do this to family." "You're right," I replied, my voice steady and clear. "Family doesn't betray family. Family doesn't plan to rob a widow while her husband is dying. Family doesn't use someone's darkest moment as a weapon. Tom would be proud that I stood up to you, just like he always told me to." Linda was crying now, mascara streaming down her face. "Please, Margaret. We have children, grandchildren. So do I. And thanks to you, they'll learn that actions have consequences." The neighbors had come out, watching as federal agents loaded Robert and Linda into separate vehicles. Mrs. Chen stood on her porch, giving me a small nod of approval. The book club ladies were clustered at the corner, phones out, probably spreading the news faster than wildfire. Before getting in the FBI vehicle, Jessica turned to me. "You did amazing, Mrs. Fisher. Your husband would be very proud." I looked at Tom's portrait through the window and knew she was right. The investigation that followed was thorough and devastating for Robert. The FBI discovered his construction company's insurance fraud went deeper than anyone imagined. He'd been billing for phantom employees, staging workplace accidents, and filing claims for equipment that never existed. The total approached $4 million in fraudulent claims over 7 years. Each forged document, each false claim, added years to his potential sentence. The paper trail he'd so meticulously created to destroy me became the very evidence that destroyed him. Linda broke within hours of arrest. Faced with her own charges, she revealed everything. How Robert had paid a hospital janitor $3,000 to photograph my medical records after hours. How they'd planned to use my grief counseling attendance as evidence of ongoing instability. How they'd even discussed having me involuntarily committed if I refused to cooperate. She produced text messages, emails, and recordings of Robert planning the entire scheme. In trying to protect herself, she handed prosecutors enough evidence to ensure Robert would never see freedom before his 70th birthday. The hospital employee who'd leaked my records was arrested 2 days later. He lost his job, his pension, and faced federal HIPAA violation charges. The hospital itself launched a comprehensive review of their security protocols and personally apologized to me, offering a substantial settlement that I directed toward mental health charities. David, Robert's son, who'd agreed to lie about my behavior, came to my house in tears the day after his parents' arrest. "Aunt Margaret, I'm so sorry. Dad said if I didn't help, he'd cut me off, wouldn't pay for my kids' college. I knew it was wrong. I didn't embrace him, didn't offer forgiveness he hadn't earned, but I didn't pursue charges against him either. Living with his choices would be punishment enough." The community response overwhelmed me. My book club showed up the morning after the arrest with casseroles and fierce loyalty. Patricia, our club president, told everyone at church exactly what had happened, framing my past mental health treatment as the brave decision it was. The story spread, but not as Robert had intended. Instead of shame, I found support. Sarah and Michael flew in immediately. When I told them about my psychiatric treatment 15 years ago, Sarah held me and cried, "Mom, you went through that alone? You're the strongest person I know." Michael added, "You got help when you needed it. That's what you taught us to do. There's no shame in that, only courage." My grandchildren, learning their grandmother had fought battles they'd never known about, looked at me with new respect rather than disappointment. The school board, rather than being scandalized, issued a public statement praising my strength and advocacy for mental health awareness. They invited me to speak at the next district meeting about the importance of seeking help during crisis. 3 former students reached out, sharing that my strength in standing up to Robert had inspired them to confront their own difficult situations. Robert's trial was swift. Faced with overwhelming evidence, his own signatures on confession documents, and recorded admissions of his crimes, his lawyer advised pleading guilty. He received 15 years in federal prison for insurance fraud, blackmail, conspiracy, and HIPAA violations. The judge, a grandmother herself, showed no mercy. "Mr. Fisher," she said during sentencing, "you attempted to weaponize mental health treatment against a grieving widow. You represent the very worst of human greed and cruelty." Linda received 5 years and hefty fines. Their house was seized to pay restitution for the insurance fraud. Their construction company was liquidated. The country club memberships, the BMW, the designer clothes Linda loved, all gone. I kept Tom's life insurance intact, using it exactly as we'd planned. Sarah's mortgage was paid off. Michael got the medical treatment he needed. 7 college funds were established. The community food bank received their donation. The elementary school got its new playground with a plaque reading, "In memory of Thomas Fisher, who believed in building better futures." 6 months later, I planted new roses in Tom's garden, varieties called Courage and Resilience. Mrs. Chen helped, sharing her own story of overcoming hardship. My psychiatric records, once weapons meant to destroy me, became testimony to survival. I still sit in Tom's chair every morning, drinking coffee from his mug, but now I don't feel alone. I feel his pride, his love, and his voice reminding me that I was always stronger than I knew. A year has passed since that morning Robert stood in my kitchen making his threats. I'm sitting in Tom's garden now, watching butterflies dance around the new roses, thinking about the nature of family, betrayal, and the strength we don't know we have until we're forced to find it. The garden is thriving, producing more tomatoes than I can give away, as if Tom's spirit is still nurturing growth from wherever he is. I've learned that greed doesn't announce itself with warning signs. It hides behind familiar faces, holiday dinners, and decades of shared memories. Robert didn't become a monster overnight. The seeds were always there, in the way he counted the value of Christmas gifts, how he noticed the price of everything, but the value of nothing, how he saw Tom's success as something stolen from him rather than something earned. Greed is patient. It waits for vulnerability, for grief, for the moment when defenses are lowest. It weaponizes love, turns family into a battlefield, and transforms sacred memories into ammunition. But I've also learned that our darkest moments don't define us. How we rise from them does. That psychiatric hold 15 years ago, which Robert tried to use as a weapon, was actually my first lesson in courage. Asking for help when you're drowning isn't weakness. It's the ultimate act of self-preservation. Every pill I took, every therapy session I attended, every day I chose to keep fighting when my brain told me to stop, those weren't symptoms of illness. They were acts of rebellion against despair. Tom knew this. He saw my breakdown not as failure, but as proof that I was human, that I loved deeply enough to grieve devastatingly, and that I was strong enough to rebuild from rubble. He never asked me to hide it, never suggested I should be ashamed. He simply loved me through it, creating a safe space where I could be both broken and whole, weak and strong, struggling and surviving. The $2 million sits in various accounts now, doing exactly what Tom intended, securing futures, funding dreams, supporting communities. But the real inheritance Tom left me wasn't money. It was the knowledge that I could stand alone when necessary, that kindness and strength aren't opposites, but partners, and that sometimes the greatest act of love is refusing to let someone diminish you, even if that someone shares your last name or your history. I still get letters from Robert in prison. I don't read them anymore. The first few were angry, threatening more revelation, more shame. Then came the bargaining, the false apologies, the requests for forgiveness wrapped in manipulation. I've learned that forgiveness doesn't mean accepting abuse, and that some relationships are too poisonous to preserve, even if society says family should forgive everything. Tom would understand. He always said that blood might make you related, but loyalty makes you family. My children now know my whole story, including the parts I hid to protect them. Instead of seeing weakness, they see a mother who faced dragons they never knew existed. My grandchildren are learning that mental health is just health, that seeking help is brave, and that standing up to bullies is necessary, even when the bully is family, especially then. Mrs. Chen and I have coffee every Tuesday now. The book club has become more than literary discussion. We're witnesses to each other's lives, guardians of each other's stories. I've spoken at 3 schools about mental health awareness, and each time someone comes up afterward to whisper their own story, their own struggle, finding courage in mine. So I ask you, watching this story unfold, what would you have done? Would you have signed those papers, choosing silence over scandal? Would you have protected your secret at any cost? Or would you have found somewhere in your grief and fear the strength to say no? Have you ever been betrayed by someone you trusted? Have you ever had your lowest moment weaponized against you? Are you keeping secrets that feel like chains, afraid that seeking help makes you weak? Let me tell you what Tom would say. You're stronger than you know. Your story, even the dark chapters, is yours to own, not anyone else's to exploit. And sometimes, the most powerful thing you can do is refuse to be made small by someone else's greed. Share your thoughts below. Tell me about a time you found strength you didn't know you had. And remember, seeking help isn't weakness. It's the first step toward becoming unbreakable. Retry Claude can make mistakes. Please double-check responses.